Welcome to our recorded lecture on exploration of infancy and toddlerhood. We will be specifically focusing on these stages of development very early in life and considering some of the important physical, cognitive, and social emotional developments that occur within this stage. We will also be taking a more in-depth look at a couple of theoretical orientations that help us to understand more about how infants and toddlers understand their worlds and their frame of reference for exploring the world, in addition to how identity really begins to develop at a very young age, and thinking about how identity is fostered and is supported throughout the life course within these initial stages of life. Attachment is another big concept that we will be talking about in this presentation, which really emphasizes the need for an infant or a toddler to have a very secure relationship with a primary caregiver. And we'll be seeing how that's beneficial for healthy growth and development of infants and toddlers, and how that can help support healthy development across the lifespan. In addition, the role of play is very important for infants and toddlers. We'll be talking about what types of play is appropriate and how to really help to support the relationship that is being created using the mechanism of play for helping infants and toddlers to better navigate their social environment and to have secure attachments with their primary caregiver. Finally, we will be exploring the risk and protective factors that are important for us to keep in mind within infancy and toddlerhood. When we examine the person in the environment, in this case, the infant in the environment, we need to think about three important aspects. We need to understand about the daily routine of the infant. What is going on in his or her physical environment and socially? What are sort of the everyday interactions that help to build a healthy attachment to a primary caregiver? And are there elements of the physical environment that may present harm to the infant? There are a variety of different child care and child rearing customs that are important to acknowledge, particularly if you're working with this group. In terms of the diversity, you may have different points of view about the best ways to raise the child. And one example of this is really focused on the reactivity and the responsiveness of the primary caregiver. In general, it's highly recommended for the primary caregiver to quote unquote spoil the infant as much as possible, to be as responsive as possible, to help build that strong relationship between the infant and the primary caregiver. Although in some traditions, it has not looked upon favorably to be as reactive and as responsive out of fear of spoiling the child. And so any kind of intervention that may involve an infant and a young mom may need to consider what is traditionally appropriate for a particular culture in helping to facilitate a stronger relationship between the two. Another element that we need to consider is because the infants are so dependent physically and physiologically on their primary caregiver or caregivers, how mom is feeling does have an effect on the development of infants. And so if mom is struggling with postpartum depression, for example, that will have an effect on her ability to have a strong relationship with her infant, and that may hinder her infant's growth and development. Infants and toddlers go through a variety of changes. And if you think about after birth, how dependent an infant is on others for feeding, for changing, for staying warm, for providing a safe place for rest, etc. And this process is really amazing to see how long the infant really does rely exclusively on the help of others before they can take some responsibility for caring for themselves. It's actually a very unique position that humans are in. Most other animals expect their young to be independent much faster in the process. When we think about what infants are born with, we know that there are a number of innate reflexes that are part of what we can do in order to help them survive. And some of these are just very taken for granted types of things that they are born being able to do. So, for example, there's a reflex that helps to make sure that the infant is able to suck and to be able to take in nutrients to its body. We also know that toddlers are able to sneeze without thinking about it, or to cough if they have something in their throat, sort of a choking reflex, so that it all serves an adaptive purpose, so that infants are able to function and to protect themselves and to help them survive. There's a brief video clip which is listed here in this slide where you can take a look at some of the different kinds of reflexes that infants have. And it also shows how toddlers then in the second year and older really go through a lot of additional physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development changes in terms of developing a lot physically, so that they're able to really hone their physical abilities to walk, to run, to play games, as well as fine motor skills, which are needed for doing more detail-oriented tasks such as writing. It's important to keep in mind that if infants struggle in one of these categories, whether it's physically, cognitively, or socio-emotionally, that this has the potential of having a long-lasting consequence for them. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that society is a very powerful force in being able to determine what is considered healthy or normal. And so these ideas fit with the idea of the person and the environment and the culture. And so at a very young age, we begin to interpret how an infant or a toddler is progressing through their development based on societal norms. In terms of physical development, infants are initially responsible for their own self-regulation. So they have to figure out, what to do if they're too cold or they're too warm. And things like sleeping, eating, and eliminating waste, all of these things are new to the infant that need to be learned. One of the elements of the sensory system allows the infants to interact with their environment. And so infants often become very busy with putting everything in their mouth and exploring as much as possible, whether that's through touch, through smell, through taste, through sight. They're very interested in using these sensory items to be able to grow physically as well as cognitively. The reflexes we were talking about a moment ago were the involuntary responses to simple stimuli that aid the infant in adapting to the environment outside of the womb. And so we talked about the sucking reflex. Also, there's a rooting reflex that helps the infant be able to kind of locate a bottle or a woman's breast so that they can find the location for them to receive nutrients. As infants get a bit older, they are able to develop motor skills, and that is the ability to move and manipulate that occurs in a very step fashion. It's a very orderly, logical sequence that helps to identify whether healthy children have achieved different motor skills. The immune system is another thing that's in rapid development in infancy, and the immune system is responsible for building our defenses against specific diseases. Another thing that is often encouraged is for infants to receive the immunizations and vaccinations that are recommended to better protect themselves from health conditions that could arise later. The brain is really going through a phenomenal stage of growth in infancy. The brain allows the infant to begin to communicate through electrical impulses that connect neurons together. And it's this opportunity of not only physiological brain growth, but also the stimulation that's available in the social environment that helps to support a very healthy growing brain. So there's a genetic element of what an individual may have been born with, But we need to also consider the early experiences that the infant has in terms of how that influences brain development. If we think about concepts such as relational poverty or situations where infants are in failure to thrive situations where their brains are literally kind of shutting down and not growing, we need to pay attention to this as social work professionals and be able to develop new ways of intervening in these situations. Sometimes there are issues with good nutrition as well as providing enough stimulation that's part of how we can support brain development. And there are some risk factors that can hinder the growth of the infant's brain. That includes any sort of toxin in the environment, any sort of abuse or emotional trauma, and deprivation. And so it's very important for us to consider how the infant is interacting with the physical environment, but also the social environment, and to understand how the infant may react to abuse, emotional trauma, or social deprivation. Now we're going to turn our attention to the cognitive development, which helps us to understand a bit more about how infants as well as toddlers really understand their world. What is their point of view? And as the child grows and develops, their worldview changes, not only in just the number of things they're able to understand or the thoughts that they can process, but these stages that Piaget has outlined detail child development in terms of qualitative differences at each stage of development. Although these stages occur in different groupings, it is possible that children can kind of be in between or both stages at the same time, depending on where they are in terms of their cognitive development. But these different steps have to be completed sequentially. Now, when infants reach between the age of 7 and 9 months, they begin to realize something called object permanence, which is a concept that is used to describe how infants are able to see their world. Instead of seeing all of the objects in front of them to know that they exist and to understand what they are, the idea of object permanence that Piaget proposed is that they now have a mental representation of what objects are within their own minds. And so this allows them to begin to understand that things exist independently of being able to see them in the environment at that particular moment in time. And so as infants begin to learn about how mom, for example, continues to exist and continues to have a relationship with them, even though they may not be physically present, these types of ways of understanding the perspective of infants are critical for practitioners to understand. So by the time an infant reaches between 7 and 9 months, they understand the concept of object permanence. They build these internal representations of objects in their own mind. And then as they begin crawling and standing and walking, this increased physical mobility allows them to really propel their cognitive development as they're able to more fully explore their social environment. And as they explore their environment to a greater degree, they begin to match these internal representations of what objects are with something that's very complex. And another milestone is the beginning to understand language and associating words with certain concepts. Now, Erikson proposed a theory of psychosocial development. It's one of the best known theories of personality and psychology. And Erikson emphasizes how an individual's identity develops, but it also takes into consideration the influence of social experiences across the whole lifespan. So Erikson developed the concept of ego identity, and that's a conscious sense of self that we develop through our social interactions. And our ego identity is constantly changing due to new experiences that we have and the information that we acquire in our daily interactions with other people. Now, as we think about how identity is beginning to be shaped, we need to go back to infancy and very early childhood. Our identity development actually begins in infancy, and that there is a sense of competence as well as a sense of some tasks that need to be achieved at each of the 8 stages that help us to track our growth and development over the lifespan. We need to achieve mastery at each of these stages. And it's important that we take these stages as a developmental approach, meaning that each stage needs to follow the other sequentially. We often think of socio-emotional development or the psychosocial development that Erickson has shared with us as a way to identify some of the critical issues that exist within each stage of development. So for this stage of life, one of the critical elements of socio-emotional development is this idea of trust versus mistrust. And Erickson says that this is the most fundamental stage in life. And the reasoning for this is because infants are so dependent on the primary caregiver that the ability of the infant to develop trust is very important, and it relates directly to the infant's ability to be in a nurturing relationship that is dependable, that is consistent, and it's of high quality. So the risk of a child who is not able to develop trust from birth to age 1.5 is that the child may not feel safe and secure in the world. And so it speaks to the importance of caregivers who are emotionally available, who are consistent, who are supportive for the infants that they care for. It's very important to do that. And so if that does not occur at this stage, throughout the individual's life, they may experience more fear and a belief that the world is unpredictable and in general not a safe place to be. Now the next stage, the next psychosocial stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, occurs between ages 1.5 to 3. And in this stage, children need really firm limits for controlling their impulses and managing their anxieties, but still with the opportunity to have freedom to explore their environment. And this stage really focuses on children developing a greater sense of personal control. They have control over food choices. They are able to express preferences for toys and for playing, for what clothes to wear, etc. But one of the critical things that typically falls around this time of life for toddlers is the issue of potty training. And so Erickson believed that learning control over one's body functions leads to a sense of independence. And Erickson suggested that there really needs to be this balance between autonomy that the toddler has as well as shame and doubt in order for the child to act with intention, within reason and limits, etc. So these two stages of psychosocial development, trust versus mistrust, and autonomy versus shame and doubt, help us to understand more about some of the critical tasks that infants and toddlers face. Now, attachment is a very natural process, and Bowlby defines attachment as the ability to form emotional bonds with other people. Attachment between the infant and the primary caregiver has a profound effect on the infant. It provides a working model for how the infant will be able to develop future relationships throughout his or her lifetime. And so Bowlby really drew attention to how important it is to pay attention to early relationships and to help parents foster strong attachments to their children at a very young age. Bowlby also explained how transitional objects, especially in toddlerhood, are able to help the toddler cope with stressful situations. So having a certain blanket or a certain teddy bear can be quite profound. Now, attachment is very closely associated with how we establish loving relationships in our lives, and Mary Ainsworth was another pioneer in this area. The video clip that I have referenced here helps us to understand a little bit more about the behavior between the toddler and the primary caregiver when the toddler encounters a strange situation. And this video clip is brief, but it gives us a sense of the relationship between the primary caregiver and the infant in terms of how the infant responds when a primary caregiver is with the infant in an interview room and then leaves and then comes back. Attachment is a natural phenomenon. It is the infant's instinct to seek out help because they are not able to meet their own needs. And it protects them from the harsh realities of life without that kind of support. The infant, in order to elicit some of the caregiving responses it needs, it uses smiling and clinging behavior. Sometimes it's a certain look that really helps to communicate with the primary caregiver or the mother and initiate the mother to respond to it in some way. Now, this everyday sort of exchange between the infant and mother creates a bond of attachment, and the infant is able to initiate the attachment process. And it's the mother then, or the adult, who is able to strengthen that bond through consistency, through warmth, and through support that he or she offers the infant. There's another video I would like you to watch that illustrates the different kinds of attachment. And so this video illustrates how there are differences between secure attachment, insecure attachment, and anxious avoidant attachment. And this is helpful in terms of being able to more specifically identify where attachment may be an issue for some infants and caregivers. There are a lot of factors that influence the ability for an infant to attach to the primary caregiver, and also attachment issues that can be related to childcare arrangements. So there could be complications in terms of the relationship that the infant has with the parents. Individuals who have a lower quality marital relationship may not be a strong example of each partner having equal attachment to the infant or having an attachment to the infant at all. Fathers are very important to have involved and to be able to provide that support and that warmth and nurturing to infants. But there are also variations in terms of cultural norms and values, in terms of what's acceptable in terms of attachment. Attachment is very important because it has a direct relationship on the brain development, what is going on physiologically within the brain. And so without this sort of emotional bonding to provide a framework for the infant to develop these pathways and to really cognitively develop to their full potential, we need to have strong relationships with an adult. The Parents as Teachers program describes an early intervention program that helps to improve the interaction between the caregiver and the infant or toddler. I've added the web link if you'd like to research this with a little bit more information about some resources that they have available and some of the processes that they use in terms of early intervention. There's also a brief video online that describes a client who is a mom who is able to reflect on the experience that she had in terms of gaining more skills as a teacher, which helped to bond with her younger child. Now, play is important at this stage of development as well as later, and children are engaged in play in a lot of different cultures, and it gives them a chance to develop their motor, cognitive, emotional, and social development skills in a variety of ways. It helps to link their thoughts or cognitive development with their bodies and being able to physically navigate the bodies and manipulate them in order to accomplish the tasks of their interest. And play is a powerful mechanism for establishing a strong relationship between parents and their child. Play is also critical in terms of helping toddlers interact with others that are about their same age group or even older. So as they grow older, their social networks expand, and the role of play is an important aspect of that. So this is a list of some different activities that can support more responsive interactions with caregivers. Now, when we are talking about infants who may have limited mobility, we can think about activities that can be done in a way that allows them to participate and to be directly involved. Now, whether they're sitting on a lap or being held or maybe lying on a floor or in a playpen or a pack and play, a lot of things that 6 to 18 months old are able to do are listed here. And these activities really help to focus their attention and to develop their memory and to begin to think about how they may be able to kind of regulate themselves in different interactions. And again, these are not specifically activities that everyone has to do, but these are ways in which parents can, or caregivers can, support healthy development of those skills for their children. And the purpose of this is to build consistent, supportive, responsive interactions between the primary caregiver and the infant. So there could be lap games where families, hold babies in their lap. Also, games like peekaboo, where they're kind of helping the infants to understand the concept of object permanence, and to be, the element of surprise when you uncover your eyes and there's actually a person there or the person goes away. The hiding games are very popular as well. They work on challenging the memory. So hiding a toy under a cloth, or perhaps playing hide and go seek with some older infants, to have someone loudly looking for them, maybe an enjoyable activity. Also, there are more challenging versions of hiding games, so hiding a ball underneath the cup, for example, and asking the infant to locate where the ball may be located. And also there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of imitating and using fingers to do maybe the itsy bitsy spider or little games like that really stimulate their sensory functioning, are interesting to consider for the younger age groups. We also encourage a lot of conversation. So with younger infants, focusing the infant's attention on naming things and pointing to things so that they are helping to build their memories of these pieces of concepts and their own mental representation of what objects are in the environment. And also, conversations in any language besides English are also helpful, because if more than one language is spoken in the home, then the infant is able to be exposed to that language. Now, as toddlers get a little bit older, from 18 months to 36 months old, one of the major things that occurs in terms of the development of more self-regulation is the understanding of language and being able to really utilize language to understand what people say, what people mean in the social environment, as well as to express themselves. And so there's a lot of very active games that toddlers can use to strengthen their physical skills, and they often really like physical challenges. So it's important that caregivers provide a lot of different types of materials where toddlers can try out new skills like throwing a ball or walking on a balance beam or running up and down or jumping, etc. Toddlers also can enjoy simple imitation games like follow the leader, and these games help to develop their memory as well as their attention. Games sometimes can involve songs, so singing or dancing is another way to really engage toddlers in play. And they also have a variety of conversations and storytelling. So um, allowing toddlers to tell their stories about what they feel and what they perceived. Um, it's helpful for adults often to begin telling a story as a way of reflecting and allowing the toddler to kind of add on to that story. There's lots of matching and sorting games, and in toddlerhood, they begin to think about using their imaginations. And so often toddlers imitate adult actions using objects that they have available. So they may be pretending to cook or they may be pretending to sweep. And these actions are not simply imitations, but they can be sustained to be able to really link the process of work that goes into creating the final product. And so this imaginary play is important where children can be asked questions about what they're doing, about why they're doing certain things, and their caregivers are encouraged to play along. So again, it's not just about these activities, but it's about the emotional environment and the emotional support that the caregiver can provide in order to foster this healthy development. Some of the risk and protective factors for toddlers and infants are important for us to consider because we want to be able to begin to develop resilience at a very young age in terms of early intervention and approaches that can help bolster the well-being of children throughout their lives. Some of the risk factors that we will see affecting this particular stage of development are poverty. And poverty is something that has a long-lasting effect on individual development. In addition, because the relationship between the infant and the caregiver is so important, we know that it's critical to have a very strong relationship between the infant and the caregiver. And if the caregiver is suffering from postpartum depression or other mental health issues, that can create a complication in establishing a secure connection or a secure attachment between the infant and the primary caregiver. So caregiving is very much an issue within this stage of development. But if we have a situation where the primary caregiver has more education, a lot of social support available, and if the infant or toddler has a very easy temperament, is easygoing, and is kind of able to cope and adapt relatively well, we need to keep both of these risk factors and protective factors in mind. And so both the risk and the protective factors have an impact on how the infant or toddler adjusts and adapts at this particular stage of development. Are there other risk factors or other protective factors that you're thinking of? Why don't you take a moment and jot down some additional thoughts that you may have in terms of risk factors or protective factors at this stage of development. Very good. This concludes our session on infancy and toddlerhood. If you have questions, please take a moment to jot those down and we can explore those together in class.